We'll move on to our next presentation. It's evaluating the utility of webinars discussing the radiation oncology residency application process in the COVID-19 era. This is being presented by Niema Razavian from Wake Forest.
Niema, hold on, I'll unmute you. Mouse hit. All right. All right.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
We can, yep.
Okay, great. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm Niema Razavian, and on behalf of my co-authors, I'm going to be presenting our work on evaluating the utility of webinars, discussing the radiation oncology residency application process in the COVID-19 pandemic. And apologies in advance if there's some background noise. Try this again. Okay, so, for those of us that are residents, we think of the application process to residency. It seems fairly simple. It might involve just a paper application, an interview, and then you make your rank list. But those of you who have gone through the process realize that there are many factors to consider for each of these steps. For the ARIS application, there's a personal statement, you talk about your interests, you have to put together a CV. When it comes to the interview, there's always, questions about how many programs to interview at, how do I prepare for the interview? And then, the rank list itself is also, can be pretty anxiety producing, knowing, what the number of programs to rank is and whether or not to contact programs post interview. Really the key to applying to radiation oncology is mentorship. And before the COVID-19 pandemic, these methods of mentorship, I think, were a bit easier for medical students. A lot of it came from doing your home radiation oncology rotation and doing your away rotations, where you would talk to faculty and residents about how to apply and get advice. But with the COVID-19 pandemic, at least for the last couple of years, these opportunities for mentorship kind of paused. In-person rotations weren't happening as much. People weren't going on as many away rotations. And while there were some virtual programs focused on, gaining exposure to radiation oncology, they weren't necessarily focused on helping people apply to the field. So, we in the ACRO resident committee wanted to know whether or not webinars can kind of help fill the knowledge gap in applying to radiation oncology. So what we did was we put together an annual webinar focused specifically on applying to radiation oncology in 2020 and 2021 and 2022. These webinars lasted approximately 1 hour. The majority of the webinar consisted of didactic lectures from residency program directors. Each PD had about 10 to 15 minutes to talk about one of the following topics: the ARIS application, the interviews, or the match process, or the rank list. And then after they gave their short talks, we did have a question and answer session. Participants were encouraged to submit questions before the session. But we also had an open chat where people could ask their questions. And so in terms of the logistics of the webinar, we did this every August, which is before the ARIS application deadline in September. We would advertise the webinar to try to get as many people to participate as possible. So we used multiple email listservs as well as social media. The webinar was conducted on Zoom, and we did record them and post them to the ACRO YouTube channel for asynchronous viewing. So just to get a sense of what people thought of the webinar, we did do an assessment during the webinar. We used the Zoom live polling feature, and we had questions at the beginning of the webinar and then at the end of the webinar. And participants were given about 2 minutes per question set to respond. So at the beginning of the webinar, we did get a sense of some baseline characteristics of the participants. Wanted to know, their training level, expected degree, training location, their plans on applying to radiation oncology, and their baseline knowledge about the application process. At the end of the webinar, after the question and answer session, we did ask participants what their perceptions of the webinar were, and they would rank their perceptions on a Likert scale from 1, signifying that the webinar did not improve their understanding at all, to 4, signifying that the webinar definitely improved their understanding. So we have data from 2 of the years we did the webinar, 2021 and 2022. For each year, we had about a little over 30 participants, so a total of almost 70 participants. 85% of participants answered the first set of baseline characteristic questions, and 71% of participants answered the perception questions. And then I also wanted to just note, in terms of asynchronous viewing, while it might seem the total participants is a low number, as of March of this past year, we did have 384 asynchronous views. Okay, so in terms of baseline characteristics, the majority of people participating in the webinar were M3 to 4s. Their expected degree was an MD degree. 75% were completing their medical school training within the United States. 78% were definitely applying to radiation oncology. And it was a split in terms of how much knowledge people came to the webinar with about the application process. About 44% said they knew a little bit about the application process, and almost 50% said they knew a lot about the process before the webinar. Otherwise, in terms of their baseline characteristics, we did look year to year to see whether or not there was any difference in the people participating. It was fairly similar between each of the years. The one exception was that there did seem to be a higher proportion of non-medical student participants in 2022. Okay, so then in terms of what people thought of the webinar, again, we had everyone kind of rank from 1 to 4, what their understanding was for 3 domains, just general understanding of the application process, understanding of the ARIS application process, and understanding of the interview process. People seem to rank their improvement in understanding the highest for the interview process. And when we compared perceptions year by year, we didn't see a difference. Okay, and then we did do kind of a subset analysis of the people who responded to the baseline knowledge question. So we tried to get a sense of, do the people who have more or less knowledge report better understanding of each of these domains? So just looking at the mean numbers, it does seem that those who came in identifying as knowing a lot about the process had an overall lower mean score in terms of improvement in understanding. But when we analyzed that by chi-square, these results weren't significant. So just to conclude, from this webinar, we believe that webinars like this can improve applicant understanding of the application process. We think one of the reasons that these webinars are helpful is that they utilize sources of information that medical students find trustful. So there was a study in the Red Journal that basically said that medical students find other residents and program directors as a good source of information. The results of this webinar are consistent with similar studies in other specialties like vascular surgery and plastic surgery. And then they seem to be beneficial regardless of kind of what people's initial knowledge base were. In terms of the point of more medical students in the webinar in the second year, that perhaps suggests one, it reflects the fact that there are now kind of more non-US medical students applying to radiation oncology residency. It also suggests that this type of webinar would be helpful for them because they might not have the opportunity to rotate within a radiation oncology department in the United States before applying to residency. And then there are, of course, some limitations to our study. We did use live polling, so we were pretty limited in terms of the questions we could ask in order to keep it practical. Unfortunately, we didn't have any follow-up with the participants after the webinar. And in terms of the knowledge assessment, again, we're pretty limited in the number of questions we could ask just from a timing perspective. Okay, and with that, I'd like to thank ROECSG, the team at ACRO, all the program directors that participated in our webinars, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.